All right, everybody, welcome to Colin Reads to You. And today we'll be reading The Books of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. All right, we'll be starting with the first book in the Earthsea cycle. That would be A Wizard of Earthsea. Look at this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful stuff. All right, here we go. A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. Here we go. Chapter 1, Warriors in the Mist. The island of Gaunt, a single mountain that lifts its peak a mile above the storm-racked northern sea, is a land famous for wizards. From the towns in its high valleys and the ports on its dark narrow bays, many a Gauntish man has gone forth to serve the lords of the archipelago in their cities as wizard or mage, or, looking for adventure, to wander working magic from isle to isle of all Earthsea. Of these, some say the greatest, and surely the greatest voyager, was the man called Sparrowhawk, who in his day became both dragon lord and archmage. His life is told in the Deed of Ged and in many songs, but this is a tale of the time before his fame, before the songs were made. He was born in a lonely village called 10 Alders, high on the mountain at the head of the northward vale. Below the village, the pastures and plowlands of the vale slope downward level below level towards the sea, and other towns lie on the bends of the river Ar. Above the village, only forest rises, ridge behind ridge, to the stone and snow of the heights. The name he bore as a child, Dunny, was given him by his mother, and that and his life were all she could give him, for she died before he was a year old. His father, the bronzesmith of the village, was a grim, unspeaking man, and since Dunny's 6 brothers were older than he by many years, and went one by one from home to farm the land or sail the sea, or work as smith in other towns of the northward vale, there was no one to bring the child up in tenderness. He grew wild, a thriving weed, a tall, quick boy, loud and proud and full of temper. With a few other children of the village, he herded goats on the steep meadows above the river springs, and when he was strong enough to push and pull the long bellow sleeves, his father made him work as the smith's boy, at a high cost in blows and whippings. There was not much work to get out of Dunny. He was always off and away, roaming deep in the forest, swimming in the pools of the river Ar, that, like all Gauntish rivers, runs very quick and cold, or climbing by cliff and scarp to the highest heights above the forest, from which he could see the sea, that broad northern ocean where, past Perigol, no islands are. A sister of his dead mother lived in the village. She had done what was needful for him as a baby, but she had business of her own, and when he could look after himself, she paid no more heed to him. But one day, when the boy was 7 years old, untaught and knowing nothing of the arts and powers that are in the world, he heard his aunt crying out words to a goat which had jumped up onto the thatch of a hut and would not come down. But it came jumping when she cried a certain rhyme to it. Next day, herding the long-haired goats on the meadows of High Fall, Dunny shouted to them the words he had heard, not knowing their use or meaning, or what kind of words they were. Nath hirith malkman, heel khan mefhan. He yelled the rhyme aloud, and the goats came to him. They came very quickly, all of them together, not making any sound. They looked at him out of the dark slot in their yellow eyes. Dunny laughed and shouted it out again, the rhyme that gave him power over the goats. They came closer, crowding and pushing round him. All at once he felt afraid of their thick, ridged horns and their strange eyes and their strange silence. He tried to get free of them and run away. The goats ran with him, keeping in a knot around him, and so they came charging down to the village at last, all the goats going huddled together, as if a rope were pulled tight around them, and the boy in the midst of them weeping and bellowing. Villagers ran from the houses to swear at the goats and laugh at the boy. Among them came the boy's aunt, who did not laugh. She said a word to the goats, and the beasts began to bleat and browse and wander, freed from the spell. "Come with me," she said to Dunny. She took him into her hut where she lived alone. She let no child enter there, usually, and the children feared the place. It was low and dusky, windowless, fragrant with herbs that hung drying from the crosspole of the roof, mint and molly and thyme, yarrow and rushwash and paramol, kingsfoil, clovenfoot, tansy, and bay. There his aunt sat cross-legged by the fire pit, and looking sidelong at the boy through the tangles of her black hair, she asked him what he had said to the goats, and if he knew what the rhyme was. When she found that he knew nothing, and yet had spellbound the goats to come to him and follow him, then she knew that he must have in him the makings of power. As her sister's son, he had been nothing to her, but now she looked at him with a new eye. She praised him and told him she might teach him rhymes he would like better, such as the word that makes the snail look out of its shell, or the name that calls a falcon down from the sky. "Aye, teach me that name," he said, being clever over the frights the goats had given him, and puffed up with the praise of her cleverness. The witch said to him, "You will not ever tell that word to the other children if I teach it to you." "I promise." She smiled at his ready ignorance. "Well and good, but I will bind your promise. Your tongue will be stilled until I choose to unbind it, and even then, though you can speak, you will not be able to speak the word I teach you where another person can hear it. We must keep the secrets of our craft." "Good," said the boy, for he had no wish to tell the secret of his playmates, liking to know and do what they knew not and could not. He sat still while his aunt bound back her uncombed hair and knotted the belt of her dress, and again sat cross-legged, throwing handfuls of leaves into the fire pit, so that a smoke spread and filled the darkness of the hut. She began to sing. Her voice changed sometimes to low or high, as if another voice sang through her, and the singing went on and on till the boy did not know if he waked or slept. And all the while the witch's old black dog, that never barked, sat by him with eyes red from the smoke. Then the witch spoke to Dunny in a tongue he did not understand, and made him say with her certain rhymes and words until the enchantment came on him and held him still. "Speak," she said to test the spell. The boy could not speak, but he laughed. Then his aunt was a little afraid of his strength, for this was as strong a spell as she knew how to weave. She had tried not only to gain control of his speech and silence, but to bind him at the same time to her service in the craft of sorcery. Yet even as the spell bound him, he had laughed. She said nothing. She threw clear water on the fire till the smoke cleared away, and gave the boy water to drink. When the air was clear and he could speak again, she taught him the true name of the falcon, to which the falcon must come down. This was Dunny's first step on the way he was to follow all his life, the way of Majory, the way that led him at last to hunt a shadow over land and sea to the lightless coast of Death's kingdom. But in those first steps along the way, it seemed a broad, bright road. When he found that the wild falcons stooped down to him from the wind when he summoned them by name, lighting, with a thunder of wings on his wrist like the hunting birds of a prince, then he hungered to know more such names, and came to his aunt begging to learn the name of the sparrowhawk and the osprey and the eagle. To earn the words of power, he did all the witch asked of him, and learned all that she could teach, though not all of it was pleasant to do or know. There is a saying in Gaunt, weak as women's magic. And there is another saying, wicked as women's magic. Now the Witch of 10 Alders was no black sorceress, nor did she ever meddle with the high arts or traffic with old powers. But being an ignorant woman among ignorant folk, she often used her crafts to foolish and dubious ends. She knew nothing of the balance and the pattern, which the true wizard knows and serves, and which keep him from using his spells unless real need demands. She had a spell for every circumstance, and was forever weaving charms. Much of her lore was mere rubbish and humbug, nor did she know the true spells from the false. She knew many curses, and was better at causing sickness, perhaps, than at curing it. Here's a little picture of Dunny and his aunt. Check it out. She could brew up a love potion, but there were other, uglier brews she made to serve men's jealousy and hate. Such practices, however, she kept from her young apprentice, and as far as she was able, she taught him honest craft. At first, all his pleasure in the art magic was childlike. The power it gave him over bird and beast, and the knowledge of these. And indeed, that pleasure stayed with him all his life. Seeing him in the high pastures, often with a bird of prey about him, the other children called him Sparrowhawk. And so he came by the name that he kept in later life as his use name, when his true name was not known. As the witch kept talking of the glory and the riches and the great power over men that a sorcerer could gain, he set himself to learn more useful lore. He was very quick at it. The witch praised him, and the children of the village began to fear him, and he himself was sure that very soon he would become great among men. So he went on from word to word, and from spell to spell, with the witch till he was 12 years old, and had learned from her a great part of what she knew. Not much, but enough for the witch wife of a small village, and more than enough for a boy of 12. She had taught him all her lore and herbals and healing, and all she knew of the crafts of finding, binding, mending, unsealing, and revealing. What she knew of Cantor's tales and the great deeds she had sung him, and all the words of the true speech that she had learned from the sorcerer that taught her, she taught again to Dunny. And from weather workers and wandering jugglers who went from town to town of the northward vale and the east forest, he had learned various tricks and pleasantries, spells of illusion. It was with one of these light spells that he'd first proved the great power that was in him. In those days, the Kargad Empire was strong. Those are 4 great lands that lie between the northern and eastern reaches: Kergo-At, Atuan, Huret-Hur, Atlini. The tongue they speak there is not like any spoken in the archipelago or the other reaches, and they are a savage people, white-skinned, yellowed hair, and fierce, liking the sight of blood and the smell of burning towns. Last year they had attacked the Torquils in the strong island Torhaven, raiding in great force in fleets of red-sailed ships. News of this came north to Gaunt, but the lords of Gaunt were busy with their piracy and paid small heed to the woes of other lands. Then Spevy fell to the Kargs and was looted and laid waste, its people taken as slaves, so that even now it is an isle of ruins. In lust of conquest, the Kargs sailed next to Gaunt, coming in a host, 30 great long ships, to Eastport. They fought through that town, took it, burned it. Leaving their ships under guard at the mouth of the River Ar, they went up the vale, wrecking and looting, slaughtering cattle and men. As they went, they split into bands, and each of these bands plundered where it chose. Fugitives brought warning to the villages of the heights. Soon the people of 10 Alders saw smoke darken the eastern sky, and that night those who climbed the high fall looked down in the vale, all hazed and red-streaked with fires, where fields ready for harvest had been set ablaze, and orchards burned, the fruit roasting on the blazing boughs, and barns and farmhouses smoldered in ruin. Some of the villagers fled up the ravines and hid in the forest, and some made ready to fight for their lives, and some did neither, but stood about lamenting. The witch was one who fled, hiding alone in a cave up on the Caperding Scarp, and sealing the cave mouth with spells. Dunny's father, the bronzesmith, was one who stayed, for he would not leave his smelting pit and forge where he had worked for 50 years. All that night he labored, beating up what ready metal he had there into spear points, and others worked with him, binding these to the handles of hoes and rakes, there being no time to make sockets and shaft them properly. There had been no weapons in the village but hunting bows and short knives, for the mountain folk of Gaunt were not warlike. It is not warriors they are famous for, but goat thieves, sea pirates, and wizards. With sunrise came a thick white fog, as on many autumn mornings in the heights of the island. Among their huts and houses down the straggling streets of 10 Alders, the villagers stood waiting with their hunting bows and new forged spears, not knowing whether the Kargs might be far off or very near, all silent, all peering into the fog that hid shapes and distances and dangers from their eyes. With them was Dunny. He had worked all night at the forge bellows, pushing and pulling the 2 long sleeves of goat hide that fed the fire with a blast of air. Now his arms so ached and trembled from that work that he could not hold out the spear he had chosen. He did not see how he could fight or be of any good to himself or the villagers. It rankled at his heart that he should die, spitted on a Kargish lance, while still a boy. That he should go into the dark land without ever having known his own name, his true name as a man. He looked down at his thin arms with cold fog dew and raged at his weakness, for he knew his strength. There was power in him, if he knew how to use it, and he sought among all the spells he knew for some device that might give him and his companions an advantage, or at least a chance. But need alone is not enough to set power free. There must be knowledge. The fog was thinning now under the heat of the sun that shone bare above the peak in a bright sky. As the mist moved and parted in great drifts and smoky wisps, the villagers saw a band of warriors coming up the mountain. They were armored with bronze helmets, and greaves and breastplates of heavy leather, and shields of wood and bronze, and armed with swords and the long Kargish lance. Winding up along the steepy bank of the Ar, they came in a plumed, clanking, straggling line, near enough already that their white faces could be seen, and the words of their jargon heard as they shouted to one another. In this band of the invading horde there were about 100 men, which is not many, but in the village were only 18 men and boys. Now need called knowledge out. Dunny, seeing the fog blow and thin across the path before the Kargs, saw a spell that might avail him. An old weatherworker of the Vale, seeking to win the boy as apprentice, had taught him several charms. One of these tricks was called fog weaving, a binding spell that gathered the mist together for a while in one place. With it, one skilled in illusion can shape the mist into fair, ghostly seemings, which last a little and fade away. The boy had no such skill, but his intent was different, and he had the strength to turn the spell to his own ends. Rapidly and aloud he named the places and the boundaries of the village, and then spoke the fog-weaving charm. But in amongst its words he enlaced the words of a spell of concealment, and last he cried the word that set the magic going. Even as he did so, his father, coming up behind him, struck him hard on the side of the head, knocking him right down. "Be still, fool! Keep your blathering mouth shut, and hide if you can't fight." Dunny got to his feet. He could hear the Kargs now at the end of the village, as near as the great yew tree by the tanner's yard. Their voices were clear, and the clink and creak of their harness and arms, but they could not be seen. The fog had closed and thickened all over the village, graying the light, blurring the world till a man could hardly see his own hands before him. "I've hidden us all," Dunny said sullenly, for his head hurt from his father's blow, and the workings of the doubled incantation had drained his strength. "I'll keep up this fog as long as I can. Get the others to lead them up to High Fall." The smith stared at his son, who stood wraith-like in that weird, dank mist. It took him a minute to see Dunny's meaning, but when he did, he ran at once, noiselessly, knowing every fence and corner of the village, to find the others and tell them what to do. Now, through the gray fog, bloomed a blur of red as the Kargs set to fire a thatch of a house. Still, they did not come up into the village, but waited at the lower end till the mist should lift and lay bare their loot and prey. The tanner, whose house it was that burned, sent a couple of boys skipping right under the Kargs' noses, taunting and yelling and vanishing again like smoke in smoke. Meantime, the older men, creeping behind fences and running from house to house, came close on the other side and sent a volley of arrows and spears at the warriors, who stood still in a bunch. One Karg fell, writhing with the spear, still warm from its forging, right through his body. Others were arrow-bitten and all enraged. They charged forward then to hew down their puny attackers, but they found only the fog about them, full of voices. They followed the voices, stabbing head into the mist with their great plumed, blood-stained lances. Up the length of the street they came shouting, and never knew they had run right through the village, as the empty huts and houses loomed and disappeared again in the writhing gray fog. The villagers ran scattering, most of them keeping well ahead since they knew the ground, but some, boys or old men, were slow. The Kargs, stumbling on them, drove their lances or hacked with their swords, yelling their war cry, the names of the white god brothers of Adawan. "Wula! Atwa!" Some of the band stopped when they felt the land grow rough underfoot, but others pressed right on, seeking the phantom village, following dim, wavering shapes that fled just out of reach before them. All the mist had come alive with these fleeting forms, dodging, flickering, fading on every side. One group of the Kargs chased the race straight into the high fall, the cliff's edge above the springs of Ar, and the shapes they pursued ran out onto the air and there vanished in a thinning of the mist, while the pursuers fell screaming through fog and sudden sunlight, 100 feet sheer to the shallow pools among the rocks. And those that came behind and did not fall stood at the cliff's edge listening. Now dread came into the Kargs' hearts, and they began to seek one another, not the villagers, in the uncanny mist. They gathered on the hillside, and yet always there were wraiths and ghost shapes among them, and other shapes that ran and stabbed from behind with spear or knife and vanished again. The cards began to run, all of them, downhill, stumbling, silent, until all at once they ran out from the gray blind mist and saw the river and the ravines below the village all bare and bright in morning sunlight. Then they stopped, gathering together, and looked back. A wall of wavering, writhing gray lay blank across the path, hiding all that lay behind it. Out from it burst 2 or 3 stragglers, lunging and stumbling along, their long lances rocking on their shoulders. Not one Karg looked back more than that once. All went down in haste away from the enchanted place. Farther down the northern vale, those warriors got their fill of fighting. The towns of the East Forest, from Ovark to the coast, had gathered their men and sent them against the invaders of Gaunt. Band after band, they came down from the hills, and that day and the next the Kargs were harried back down to the beaches above Eastport, where they found their ships burnt. So they fought with their backs to the sea, till every man of them was killed, and the sands of Armouth were brown with blood until the tide came in. But on that morning in Tunalder's village, and up on the high fall, the dank gray fog had clung a while, and then suddenly it blew and drifted and melted away. This man and that stood up in the windy brightness of the morning and looked about him, wondering. Here lay a dead Karg with yellow hair, long, loose, and bloody. There lay the village tanner, killed in a battle like a king. Down in the village, the house that had been set afire still blazed. They ran to put the fire out, since their battle had been won. In the street near the great yew they found Dunny, the bronzesmith's son, standing by himself, bearing no hurt, but speechless and stupid like one stunned. They were well aware of what he had done, and they led him into his father's house and went calling for the witch to come down out of her cave and heal the lad who had saved their lives and their property. All but 4 who were killed by the Kargs in the one house that was burnt. No weapon hurt had come to the boy, but he would not speak, nor eat, nor sleep. He seemed not to hear what was said to him, not to see those who came to see him. There was none in these parts wizard enough to cure what ailed him. His aunt said, "He has overspent his power," but she had no art to help him. While he lay thus dark and dumb, the story of the lad who wove the fog and scared off Kargish swordsmen with a mess of shadows was told all down the northward vale, and in the east forest, and high on the mountain, and over the mountain, even in the great port of Gaunt. So it happened that on the 5th day after the slaughter at Armouth, a stranger came into Tunalder's village, a man neither young nor old, who came cloaked and bareheaded, lightly carrying a great staff of oak that was as tall as himself. He did not come up the course of the Ar like most people, but down, out of the forests of the higher mountainside. The village goodwives saw well that he was a wizard, and when he told them that he was a heal-all, they brought him straight to the smith's house. Sending away all but the boy's father and the aunt, the stranger stooped above the cot where Dunny lay stirring in the bed, and did no more than lay his hand on the boy's forehead and touch his lips once. Dunny sat up slowly, looking about him. In a little while he spoke, and strength and hunger began to come back into him. They gave him a little to drink and eat, and he lay back again, always watching the stranger with dark, wondering eyes. The bronzesmith said to the stranger, "You are no common man." "Nor will this boy be a common man," the other answered. "The tale of his deed with the fog has come to Rialbi, which is my home. I have come here to give him his name, if, as they say, he has not yet made his passage into manhood." The witch whispered to the smith, "Brother, this must surely be the mage of Rialbi, Ogion the Silent, that one who tamed the earthquake." "Sir," said the bronzesmith, who would not let the great name taunt him, "my son will be 13 this month coming, but we thought to hold his passage at the Feast of Sun Return this winter." "Let him be named as soon as he may be," said the mage, "for he needs his name. I have other business now, but I will come back here for the day you choose. If you see fit, I will take him with me when I go thereafter. And if he prove apt, I will keep him as prentice, or see that he is to be schooled as fits his gifts. For to keep dark the mind of the mage born, that is a dangerous thing." Very gently Ogion spoke, but with certainty, and even the hard-headed smith assented to all he said. On the day the boy was 13 years old, a day in the early splendor of autumn, while still the bright leaves are on the trees, Ogion returned to the village from his rovings over the gaunt mountain, and the ceremony of passage was held. The witch took from the boy his name Dunny, the name his mother had given him as a baby. Nameless and naked, he walked in the cold springs of the Ar, where it rises among rocks under the high cliffs. As he entered the water, clouds crossed the sun's face, and great shadows slid and mingled over the water of the pool about him. He crossed the far bank, shuddering with cold, but walking slow and erect, as he should through that icy, living water. As he came to the bank, Ogion, waving, reached out his hand and, clasping the boy's arm, whispered to him his true name, Ged. Thus was he given his name by one very wise in the uses of power. The feasting was far from over, and all the villages were making merry, with plenty to eat and beer to drink, and a cantor from down the vale singing the deed of the dragon lords, when the maid spoke in his quiet voice to Ged, Come, lad, bid your people farewell, and leave them feasting. Ged felt that he had to carry all that he had to carry, which was a good bronze knife his father had forged him, and a leather coat the tanner's widow had cut down to his size, and an alder stick his aunt had becharmed for him. That was all he owned besides his shirt and breeches. He said farewell to them, all the people he knew in all the world, and looked about once at the village that straggled and huddled there under the cliffs over the river springs. Then he set off with his new master through the steep slanting forests of the mountain aisle, through the leaves and the shadows of bright autumn. Chapter 2. The Shadow. Ged had thought that as the apprentice of a great mage he would enter at once into the mystery and mastery of power. He would understand the language of the beasts and the speech of the leaves of the forest, he thought, and sway the winds with his word, and learn to change himself into any shape he wished. Maybe he and his master would run together as stags, or fly to Rialbi over the mountain on the wings of eagles. But it was not so at all. They wandered first down to the vale, and then gradually south and westward around the mountain, given lodging in little villages, or spending the night out in the wilderness like poor journeyman sorcerers or tinkers or beggars. They entered no mysterious domain. Nothing happened. The mage's oaken staff that Ged had watched at first with eager dread was nothing but a stout staff to walk with. 3 days went by, and 4 days went by, and still Ogion had not spoken a single charm in Ged's hearing, and had not taught him a single name or rune or spell. Though a very silent man, he was so mild and calm that Ged soon lost his awe of him, and in a day or two he was bold enough to ask his master, When will my apprenticeship begin, sir? It has begun, said Ogion. There was a silence, as if Ged was keeping back something he had to say. Then he said it. But I haven't learned anything yet. Because you haven't found out what I am teaching, replied the mage, going on at his steady, long-legged pace along the road, which was the high pass between Ovark and Weiss. He was a dark man, like most Gondishmen, dark copper-brown, gray-haired, lean and tough as a hound, tireless. He spoke seldom, ate little, slept less. His eyes and ears were very keen, and often there was a listening look on his face. Ged did not answer him. It is not always easy to answer a mage. You want to work spells? Ogion said presently, striding along. You've drawn too much water from that well. Wait. Manhood is patience. Mastery is 9 times patience. What is that herb by the path? Straw flower. And that? I don't know. Forefoil, they call it. Ogion had halted, the copper-shod foot of his staff, near the little weed, so Ged looked closely at the plant and plucked a dry seed pod from it, and finally asked, since Ogion said nothing more, What is its use, master? None I know of. Ged kept the seed pod a while as they went on, then tossed it away. When you know the forefoil in all its season's root, and the leaf and flower, by sight and scent and seed, then you may learn its true name, knowing its being, which is more than its use. What, after all, is the use of you, or of myself? Is Gaunt Mountain useful, or the open sea? Ojian went on for a half mile or so, and said at last, "To hear, one must be silent." The boy frowned. He did not like to be made to feel a fool. He kept back his resentment and impatience and tried to be obedient, so that Ojian would consent at last to teach him something, for he hungered to learn, to gain power. It began to seem to him, though, that he could have learned more walking with any herb gatherer or village sorcerer. And as they went round the mountain westward into the lonely forest past Weiss, he wondered more and more what was the greatness and the magic of this great mage Ojian. For when it rained, Ojian would not even say the spell that, like every weather worker knows, to send the rain aside. In a land where sorcerers come thick, like Gaunt or the Enlades, you may see a rain cloud blundering slowly from side to side and place to place, as one spell shunts it on to the next, till at last it is buffeted out over the sea, where it can rain in peace. But Ojian let the rain fall where it would. He found a thick fir tree and lay down beneath it. Ged crouched among the dripping bushes, wet and sullen, and wondered what was the good of having power if you were too wise to use it, and wished he had gone as prentice to that old weatherworker of the vale, where at least he would have slept dry. He did not speak any of his thoughts aloud. He said not a word. His master smiled, and he fell asleep in the rain. Along towards sun return, when the first heavy snows began to fall on the heights of Gaunt, they came to Realby, Ojian's home. It is a town on the edge of the high rocks of Overfell, and its name means Falcon's Nest. From it one can see far below the deep harbor and the towers of the port of Gaunt, and the ships that go in and out of the gate of the bay between the armed cliffs, and far to the west across the sea one may make out the blue hills of Oranea, easternmost of the Inward Isles. The mage's house, though large and soundly built of timber, with hearth and chimney rather than a fire pit, was like the huts of Ten Alders village, all one room, with a goat shed built onto one side. There was a kind of alcove in the west wall of the room where Ged slept. Over his pallet was a window that looked out on the sea. Most often the shutters must be closed against the great winds that blew all winter from the west and the north. In the dark warmth of that house Ged spent the winter, hearing the rush of rain and wind outside, or the silence of snowfall, learning to write and read the 600 rules of Hardic. Very glad he was to learn this lore, for without it no mere rote learning of charms and spells will give a man true mastery. The Hardic tongue of the archipelago, though it has no more magic power in it than any other language of men, has its roots in the old speech, that language in which things are named with their true names. And the way to the understanding of this speech starts with the runes that were written when the islands of the world first were raised up from the sea. Still no marvels and enchantments occurred. All winter there was nothing but the heavy pages of the rune book turning, and the rain and the snow falling. And Ojian would come in from roaming the icy forests or from looking after his goats, and stamp the snow off with his boots, and sit down in silence by the fire. And the mage's long, listening silence would fill the room and fill Ged's mind until sometimes it seemed he had forgotten what words sounded like. And when Ojian spoke at last, it was as he had just then and for the first time invented speech. Yet the words he spoke were no great matters, but had to do with only simple things: bread and water and weather and sleep. As the spring came on, quick and bright, Ojian often set Ged forth to gather herbs on the meadows above Realby, and told him to take as long as he liked about it, giving him freedom to spend all day wandering by rain-filled streams and through the woods and over wet green fields in the sun. Ged went with delight each time and stayed out till night, but he did not entirely forget the herbs. He kept an eye out for them while he climbed and roamed and waited and explored, and always brought some home. He came on a meadow between two streams where the flower called White Hollows grew thick, and as these blossoms are rare and prized by healers, he came back again next day. Someone else was there before him, a girl. whom he knew by sight as the daughter of the Lord of Reality. He would not have spoken to her, but she came to him and greeted him pleasantly. I know you. You are the Sparrowhawk, our mage's adept. I wish you could tell me about sorcery. He looked down at the white flowers that brushed against her white skirt, and at first he was shy and glum and hardly answered. But she went on talking in an open, careless, willful way that little by little set him at ease. She was a tall girl of about his own age, very willful, very sallow, almost white-skinned. Her mother, they said in the village, was from Osco, or some such foreign land. Her hair fell long and straight like a fall of black water. Ged thought her very ugly, but he had a desire to please her, to win her admiration, that grew on him as they talked. She made him tell all the story of his tricks with the mist that he had defeated the Kargish warriors, and she listened as if she wondered and admired, but she spoke no praise. And soon she was off on another tack. Can you call the birds and beasts to you? She asked. I can, said Ged. He knew there was a falcon's nest in the cliffs above the meadows, and he summoned the bird by its name. It came, but did not light on his wrist, being put off no doubt by the girl's presence. It screamed and struck the air with broad, barred wings, and rose up on the wind. What do you call that kind of charm that made the falcon come? A spell of summoning. Can you call the spirits of the dead to come to you? He thought that she was mocking him with this question, because the falcon had not fully obeyed his summons. He would not let her mock him. I might, if I chose, he said in a calm voice. Is it not very difficult, very dangerous to summon a spirit? Difficult, yes. Dangerous? He shrugged. This time he was almost certain there was admiration to her eyes. Can you make a love charm? That is no mastery. True, says she. Any village witch could do it. Can you do a changing spell? Can you change your own shape as wizards do, they say? Again, he was not quite sure that she did not ask the question mockingly, and so again he replied, I might if I chose. She began to beg him to transform into anything he wished, a hawk, a bull, a fire, a tree. He put her off with some short secretive words, such as his master used, and he did not know how to refuse flatly when she coaxed him. And besides, he did not know whether he himself believed his boast or not. He left her, saying that his master, the mage, expected him home, and did not come back to the meadow the next day. But the day after, he came again, saying to himself that he should gather more of the flowers while they bloomed. She was there, and together they waded through barefoot in the bloggy peas, pulling of the heavy white hollow blooms. The sun of spring shone, and she talked with him as merrily as any goat-herd lass of his own village. She asked him again about sorcery, and listened wide-eyed to all he told her, and so that he fell to boasting again. Then she asked him if he would not work a changing spell, and when he put her off, she looked at him, putting back the black hair from her face, and said, Are you afraid of me? No, I am not afraid. She smiled a little disdainfully and said, Maybe you are too strong. That he would not endure. Oh, excuse me, maybe you are too young. Can't read. That he would not endure. He did not say much, but he resolved that he would prove himself to her. He told her to come again to the meadow tomorrow if she liked, and so took leave of her and came back to the house while his master was still out. He went straight to the shelf and took down the 2 lore books, which Ogion had never yet opened in his presence. He looked for a spell of self-transformation, but being slow to read the runes yet, and understanding little of what he read, he could not find what he sought. These books were very ancient, Ogion having them from his own master, Helith Farseer, and Helith from his master, the Mage of Perigol, and so back into the times of myth. Small and strange was the writing, overwritten and interlined by many hands, and those hands were dust now. Yet here and then But here and there Ged understood something of what he has tried to read, and with the girl's questions and her mockery always in his mind, he stopped on a purge that bore a spell of summoning the spirits of the land. As he read it, puzzling out the runes and the symbols one by one, a horror came over him. His eyes were fixed, and he could not lift them until he had finished reading all the spell. Then, raising his head, he saw it was dark in the house. He had been reading without any light in the darkness. He could not see what he could not now make out the runes when he looked down at the book. Yet the horror grew in him, seeming to hold him bound in his chair. He was cold. Looking over his shoulder, he saw that something was crouching behind the closed door. A shapeless cloud of shadow darker than the darkness. It seemed to reach out towards him and to whisper, and to call to him in a whisper, but he could not understand the words. The door was flung wide, and a man entered with a white light flaming about him, a great bright figure who spoke aloud fiercely and suddenly. The darkness and the whispering increased and ceased and were dispelled. The horror went out of Ged, but still he was mortally afraid, for it was Ogian the mage, who stood there in the doorway with the brightness all about him, and the oaken staff in his hand turned into a white radiance. Saying no word, the mage came past Ged and lighted the lamp and put the books away on their shelf. Then he turned to the boy and said, "You will never work that spell in peril of your power and your life. Was it for that spell you opened the book?" "No, master," the boy murmured, and shamefully he told Ogian what he had sought and why. "You do not remember what I told you? The girl's mother... Oh, excuse me. You do not remember what I told you, that the girl's mother, the Lord's wife, is an enchantress?" Indeed, Ogian had once said this, but Ged had not paid much attention, though he knew by now that Ogian never told him anything that he had not good reason to tell him. The girl herself is a witch already. It may be the mother who sent the girl to talk you. It may be she who opened the book to the page you read. The powers she serves are not the powers I serve. I do not know her will, but I do know that she does not will me well. Ged, listen to me now. Have you ever thought how danger must surround power as shadow does light? This sorcery is not a game we play for our pleasure or for praise. Think of this, that every word, every act of our is said and done either for good or evil. But you speak or do what you must, and you must know the price that is to pay. Driven by his shame, Gad cried, "How am I to know these things when you teach me nothing? Since I lived with you, I have done nothing and seen nothing. Now you have been waiting," said the mage. "And now you have seen something by the door in the darkness when I came in." Ged was silent. Ogian knelt down and built a fire on the hearth and lit it, for the house was cold. Then, still kneeling, he said in a quiet voice, "Ged, my young falcon, you are not bound to me or to my service. You did not come to me, but I to you. You are very strong, or you are very young to make this choice, but I cannot make it for you. If you wish, I will send you to Roke Island, where all high arts are taught. Any craft you undertake to learn, you will learn, for your power is great. But you lack, and I will not keep you against your will. Now choose between Realby and Roke." Ged stood dumb, his heart bewildered. He had come to love this man, Ogian, who had healed him with a touch, and who had no anger. He loved him, and had not known it until now. He looked at the oaken staff leaning in the chimney corner, remembering the radiance of it that had burned out the evil from the dark, and he yearned to stay with Ogian, to go wandering through the forest with him long and far, learning how to be silent. Yet other cravings were in him that he would not be stilled, and wish for glory and the will to act. Ogian's seemed a long road towards mastery, a slow bypath to follow, when he might go sailing before the seaweed straight to the inmost isle, to the Isle of Wees, the Isle of the Wise, where the air was bright with enchantments and the archmage walked amidst wonders. Master, he said, I will go to Roke. So a few days later, on a sunny morning of spring, Ogian strode beside him down the steep road from the Overfell, 15 miles to the great port of Gaunt. There, at the hand gate, between carved dragons of the guard of the city, Gaunt, seeing the mage, knelt with bared swords and welcomed him. They knew him and did him honor by the prince's order and their own will. For 10 years ago, Ogian had saved the city from earthquake that had shaken the towers of the rich down to the ground and closed the channel of the armed cliffs with avalanche. He had spoken to the mountain of Gaunt, calming it, and had stilled the trembling precipices of the Overfell as one soothes the frightened beast. Ged had heard some talk of this, and now, wondering to see the armed guardsmen kneel to his quiet master, he remembered it. He glanced up almost in fear at this man who had stopped an earthquake, but Ogian's face was quiet as always. They went down to the quays where the harbor master came hastening to welcome Ogian and ask what service he might do. The maid told him, and at once he named a ship bound for the inmost sea, aboard which Ged might go as passenger. Ogian had I lost my spot. Boop, 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 boop. Or they will take him as windbringer, he said. If he has the craft, they have no weatherworker aboard. He has some skill with mist and fog, but none with the sea winds, the mage said, putting his hand lightly on Ged's shoulder. Do not try any tricks with the sea and the winds of the sea, Sparrowhawk. You are a landsman still. Harbor master, what is the ship's name? Shadow, from the Andrades. Bound to Hort Town with furs and ivories. A good ship, Master Ogian. The mage's face darkened at the name of the ship, but he said, So be it. Give this writing to the ward of the school on Roke, Sparrowhawk. Go with a fair wind. Farewell. That was all his parting. He turned away and went striding up the street, away from the quays. Ged stood forlorn and watched his master go. Come along, lad, said the harbor master, and took him down to the waterfront to the pier where Shadow was still making ready to sail. It might seem strange that on an island 50 miles wide, in a village under cliffs that stare out forever on the sea, a child may grow to manhood, never having stepped in a boat or dipped his finger in salt water. But it is so. Farmer, goat herd, cattle herd, hunter, or artisan, the landsman looks at the ocean as at a salty, unsteady realm that has nothing to do with him at all. The village 2 days' walk from his village is a foreign land, and the island a day's sail from his island is a mere rumor. Many misty hills seen across the water, and the solid ground that he walks on are not to be found. So to Ged, who had never been down from the heights of the mountain, the port of Gaunt was an awesome and marvelous place. The great houses and towers of cut stone, and waterfront of piers and docks and basins and moorages. The seaport where 100 boats and galleys rocked at quayside or lay hauled up and overturned for repairs and stood out at anchor in the roadstead, with furled sails and closed oar-ports. The sailors shouting in a strange dialect, and the longshoremen running heavy-laden amongst the barrels, in boxes and coils of rope and stacks of oars, the bearded merchant in furred robes covering quietly as he picked his way along the slimy stones above the water, the fishermen unloading their catch, coopers pounding and shipmakers hammering, and calm sellers singing and shipmasters bellowing, and above all the silent bay. With eyes and ears and mind bewildered, he followed the harbor master to the broad dock where Shadow was tied up, and the harbor master brought him to the master of the ship. With few words spoken, the ship's master agreed to take Ged as passenger to Roke, since it was a mage that had asked it, and the harbor master left the boy with him. The master of the shadow was a big man, and fat, in a red cloak trimmed with Malawi fur, such as Andradian merchants do. He never looked at Gad, but asked him in a mighty voice, "Can you work today, boy?" "I can." "Can you bring the wind?" He had to say he could not, and with that the matter told him to find a place out of the way and stay in it. The oarsmen were coming aboard now, for the ship was going out in the roadstead before nightfall, and sail with Cobble near dawn. There was no place out of the way, but Ged climbed up as well as he could onto the flatbed. Onto the bundled flatbed, lashed in ink and hide-covered cargo, in the stern of the ship, and clinging there, watched all that had passed. The oarsmen came helping. Oh God, excuse me, everyone. The oarsmen came leaping aboard, sturdy men with great arms, while longshoremen rolled water barrels thundering out the dock and stowed them under the rowers' benches. The well-built ship rolled low with her burden, yet danced low on the lapping shore waves, ready to be gone. Then the steersman took his place at the right of the stern post, looking forward to the ship's master, who stood on a plank let in at the jointure of the keel and the stem, which was carved on an old serpent of Andrade. The master roared his orders hugely, and Shadow was untied and towed clear of the docks by two laboring men. The master's roar was, "Open ports!" And the great oars did not stop. And the great rowers, oh my goodness, excuse me, everyone. My eyes are starting to fail me from being up so late. And the great oars shot rattling out, 15 to a side. The rowers bent their strong backs, while a lad up beside the master beat the stroke on a drum. Easy as a gull oared by her wings, the ship went now, and the noise and the hurly-burly of the city fell away suddenly behind. They came out in the silence of the waters of the bay, and over them rose the white peaks of the mountain, seeming to hang above the sea. In a shallow creek in the lee of the southern armed cliff, the anchor was thrown over, and they rode there during the night. Of the 70 crewmen of the ship, some were like Ged, very young in years, though all had made their passage into manhood. These lads called him over to share food and drink with him, and were friendly enough, though rough and full of jokes and jibes. They called him Goatherd, of course, because he was gauntish, but they didn't go any further than that. He was tall and strong as a 15-year-old, and quick to return either a good word or a jeer, so he made his way among men and among them, and even that first night began to live as one of them and learn their work. This suited the ship's officers, for there was no room aboard for idle passengers. There was little enough room for the crew, but no comfort at all, in an undecked galley crowded with men and gear and cargo. But what was comfort to Ged? He lay that night among corded rolls of pelts from the northern isles and watched the stars of spring above the harbor waters and the little yellow lights of the city astern. And he slept and waked again, full of delight. Before the dawn, the tide turned. They raised anchor and rowed softly out between the armed cliffs. As sunrise reddened the mountain of Gaunt behind them, they raised the high sail and ran southwards toward the Gauntish Sea. Between Barnisk and Torhaven they sailed with a light wind. On the second day came in sight of Havnor, the great island, heart and hearth of the archipelago. For 3 days they were in sight of the green hills of Havnor, as they worked along its eastern coast, but they did not come to shore. Now, not for many years did Ged set foot on the land or see that white tower of Havnor, great port at the center of the world. They lay over one night at Kimbermouth, the northern port of Way Island, and the next at a little town on the entrance of Felkway Bay, and the next day passed the northern cape of O and entered the Ebavnor Straits. There they dropped sail and rowed always with land on either side, and always within hail of other ships, great and small, merchants and traders, some bound in from the outer reaches, and who sang strange songs and had strange cargo after a voyage of years, and others that hopped like sparrows from isle to isle of the inmost sea, turning southward of the crowded straits. They left Havnor stern and sailed between the two fair islands, Arc and Ilium, toward the terraced and towered cities, and then through the rain and rising wind began to beat their way across the inmost sea to Roke Island. In the night, as the wind freshened to a gale, they took down both sail and mast, and the next day, all day, they rowed. The long ship lay steady on the waves and went gallantly, but the steersman at the long steering sweep in the stern looked into the rain that beat the sea and saw nothing but the rain. They went southwest by the pointing of the magnet, knowing how they went, but not through what waters. Ged heard men speak of the shoal waters north of Roe, and of the borealess rocks to the east. Others argued that they may be far out of course by now, in the empty waters south of Camry. Still the wind grew stronger, tearing the edges of the great waves into flying tatters of foam. And still they rowed southwest with the wind behind them. The stints at the oars were shortened, for the labor was very hard. The younger lads were set two to an oar, and Ged took his turn with the others as he had since they left Gaunt. When they did not row, they bailed, for the seas broke heavy on the ship. So they labored amongst the waves that ran like smoking mountains under the wind, while the rain beat hard and cold on their backs, and the drum thumping through the noise of the storm like a heart thumping. A man came to take Ged's place at the oar, sending him to slip to the ship masters in a bow, rainwater dripping from the helm of the master's cloak. But he stood out as a wine barrel on his bit of decking, and looked down at Ged, and he asked, "Can you abate this wind, lad?" "No, sir." "Have you craft with iron?" He meant, could Ged make the compass needle point that their way could Ged make the compass needle point their way to Roke, making the magnet follow not its north but their need? That skill is the secret of the sea masters, and Ged said no. "Well then," the master bellowed through the wind and rain, "you must find some ship to take you back to Roke from Hort Town. Roke must be west of us now, and only wizardry could bring us back through this sea. We just keep south." Ged did not like this, for he had heard the sailors talk of Hort Town, how it was a lawless place full of evil traffic, where men were often taken and sold into slavery in the South Reach. Returning to his labor at the oar, he pulled away with his companion, a sturdy Androdian lad, and heard the drum beat the stroke, and saw the lantern hung on the stern bob and flicker as the wind plucked it about. A tormented fleck of light, and the rain lashed dusk. He kept looking westward, as often as he could in the heavy rhythm of pulling the oar, and the ship rose on a height. And as the ship rose on a high swell, he saw for a moment over the dark smoking water a light between clouds, as it might be the last gleam of sunset. But this was a clear light, not red. His oar-mate had not seen it, but he called it out. The steersman watched for it on each side of the great waves, and saw it as Ged saw it, but shouted back that it was only the setting sun. Then Ged called to one of the lads that was bailing to take his place on the bench a minute, and made his way forward again along the encumbered aisle between the benches, and catching holding of the carved prow to keep himself from being pitched over. He shouted up to the master, "Sir, that light to the west is Roke Island." "I saw no light," the master roared, but even as he spoke, Ged put out his arm, pointing, and all saw the light gleam clear in the west over the heavy, and heaving scud and tumult of the sea. Not for his passenger's sake, but to save his ship from the peril of the storm, the master shouted at once to the steersman to head westward toward the light. But he said to Ged, "Bow," or, jeez, "Boy, you speak like a sea master, but I tell you, I'll lead you, if you lead us wrong in this weather, I throw you over to swim into Roke." Now, instead of running before the storm, they must row across the wind's way, and it was hard. Waves striking the ship abeam pushed her always south of their new course, and rolled her and filled her with water so that bailing must be ceaseless. And the oarsmen must match lest the ship rolling, or much watch lest the ship rolling should lift their oars out of water as they pulled, and so pitch them down among the benches. It was nearly dark under the storm clouds, but now and again they made out the light of the west. Again to set course by, and so struggled on. At last the wind dropped a little, and the light grew broad before them. They rowed on, and they came, as it were, through a curtain, between one oar stroke and the next, running out of the storm into a clear air, where the light after sunset glowed in the sky and on the sea. Over the foam-crested waves, they saw not a far cliff. Oh God, I just lost my place again. They saw not a high cliff. Oh my gosh, excuse me, everyone. Over the foam-crested waves, they saw far off a high, round, green hill, and beneath its town, built on a small bay where boats lay at anchor, all in peace. The steersman, leaning on his long sweep, turned his head and called, "Sir, is this true land or a witchery? Keep her as she goes, you witless wooden head. Row, you spineless Slav sons. That's the Twill Bay and the Knoll of Roke, as any fool could see. Row!" So to the beat of the drum they rowed wearily into the bay. There it was still, and so that they could hear the voices of people up in the town and the bell ringing, and only far off the hiss and roaring of the storm. Clouds hung dark to the north and east and south of a mile off all about the island, but over Roke stars were coming out one by one in a clear and quiet sky. Ooh, I need a drink because my throat is parched. Whew. Okay. And sorry about making so many mistakes, folks. My eyes are failing me as I have had very little sleep, but I shall endure. All right, here we go. Chapter 3, The School for Wizards. Ged slept that night aboard Shadow, and early in the morning parted with those first sea comrades of his, they shouting good wishes cheerily after him as he went up the docks. The town of Thwill is not large, its high houses huddling close over a few steep, narrow streets. To Ged, however, it seemed a city, and not knowing where to go, he asked the first townsman of Thwill he met where he would find the warder of the school on Roke. The man looked at him sidelong a while and said, "The wise don't need to ask. The fool asks in vain," and so went on along the street. Ged went uphill until he came out into a square rimmed on three sides by the houses with their sharp slate roofs, and the fourth side by the wall of a great building with few small windows where higher than the chimney tops of the houses. A fort or castle, it seemed, built of mighty gray blocks of stone. In the square beneath its market booths were set up, and there were some coming and going of people. Ged asked his question of an old woman with a basket of mussels, and she replied, "You cannot always find the warder where he is, but sometimes you find him where he is not," and went on crying her mussels to sell. In the great building, near one corner, there was a mean little door of wood. Ged went to this and knocked loud. To the old man who opened the door, he said, "I bear a letter from the mage Ogian of Gaunt to the warder of the school in this island. I want to find the warder, but I will not hear more riddles and scoffing." "This is the school," the old man said mildly. "I am the doorkeeper. Enter if you can." Ged stepped forward. It seemed to him that he had passed through the doorway, yet he stood outside on the pavement where he had stood before. Once more he stepped forward, and once more he remained standing outside the door. The doorkeeper inside watched him with mild eyes. Ged was not so much baffled as angry, for this seemed like a further mockery to him. With voice and hand he made the opening spell which his aunt had taught him long ago. It was the prize among all of her stock of spells, and he wove it well now. But it was only a witch's charm, and the power that held this doorway was not moved at all. When that failed, Ged stood a long while there on the pavement. At last he looked at the old man who waited inside. I cannot enter, he said unwillingly, unless you help me. The doorkeeper answered, Say your name. Then again Ged stood for a while, for a man never speaks his own name aloud until more than his life's safety is at stake. I am Ged, he said aloud. Stepping forward then, he entered the open doorway. Yet it seemed to him that though the light was behind him, a shadow followed him in at his heels. He saw also as he turned that the doorway through which he had come was not plain, wood as he had thought, but ivory without joint or seam. It was cut, as he knew later, from the tooth of a great dragon. The door that the old man closed behind him was of polished horn, through which the daylight shone dimly, and on its inner face was carved the thousand-leaved tree. Welcome to this house, lad, the doorkeeper said, and without saying more, led him through the halls and corridors to an open court far inside the walls of the building. The court was partly paved with stone, but was roofless, and on a grass plot a fountain played under young trees in the sunlight. There Ged waited alone some while. He stood still, and his heart beat hard, for it seemed to him that he felt presences and powers at work unseen about him. And he knew that this place was built not only of stone, but of magic, stronger than stone. He stood in the innermost room of the House of the Wise, and it was open to the sky. Then suddenly he was aware of a man clothed in white, who watched him through the falling water of the fountain. As their eyes met, a bird sang aloud in the branches of the tree. In that moment, Ged understood the singing of the bird and the language of the water falling in the basin of the fountain, in the shape of the clouds, and the beginning and end of the wind that stirred of the leaves. It seemed to him that he himself was a word spoken by the sunlight. Then that moment passed, and he and the world were as before, or almost as before. He went forward to kneel before the archmage, who, holding out to him the letter written by Ogion. The archmage Nemiril, warder of Roke, was an old man, older, it was said, than any man then living. His voice quavered like the bird's voice when he spoke, welcoming Ged kindly. His hair and beard and robe were white, and he seemed as if all darkness and heaviness had been leached out of him by the slow usage of the years, leaving him white and worn as driftwood that has been a century adrift. My eyes are old. I cannot read what your master writes, he said in his quavering voice. Read me the letter, lad. So Ged made out and read aloud the writing, which was in Hardic runes, and said no more than this. Lord Nemiril, I send you one who will be the greatest of the wizards of Gaunt, if the wind blow true. This was signed not with Ogion's true name, which Ged had never yet learned, but with Ogion's rune, the closed mouth. He who holds the earthquake on a leash is sent to you, for which we'd be doubly welcome. Young Ogion was dear to me when he came here to help from Gaunt. Now, tell me of the seas and the portents of your voyage, lad. A fair passage, lord, but for the storm yesterday. What ship brought you here? Shadow, trading from the Andrades. Whose will sent you here? My own. And here is a cool little illustration of Ged before the Archmage. Or Archmage, however you would like to pronounce it. The Archmage looked at Ged and looked away, and began to speak in a tongue that Ged did not understand, mumbling as will an old man whose wits go wandering among the years and islands. Yet in among his mumbling there were words of what the birds had sung and what the water had said falling. He was not laying a spell, and yet there was a power in his voice that moved Ged's mind so that the boy was bewildered, and for an instant seemed to behold himself standing in a strange vast desert place, alone among shadows. Yet all along he was in the sunlit court, hearing the fountain fall. A great black bird, a raven of Osco, came walking over the stone terrace in the grass. It came to the hem of the archmage's robe and stood there all black with its dagger beak and eyes like pebbles staring sidelong at Ged. It pecked 3 times in the white staff Nemuro leaned on, and the old wizard ceased muttering and smiled. "Run and play, lad," he said at last to the little child. Geld knelt again on one knee to him. When he rose, the archmage was gone. Only the raven stood eyeing him, its beak outstretched as if to peck the varnished staff. It spoke in what Ged guessed might be the speech of Osco. "Teranan a spook," it was said croaking. "Teranan a spook orek," and it strutted off as it had come. Ged turned to leave the courtyard, wondering where he should go. Under the archway, he was met by a tall youth who greeted him very courteously, bowing his head. "I am called Jasper, Enwit's son of the domain of Eolg of Hadnor Island. I am at your service today to show you about the great house and answer your questions as I can. How shall I call you, sir?" Now it seemed to Ged, a mountain villager who had never been among the sons of rich merchants and noblemen, that this fellow was scoffing at him with his service and his sir, and his bowing and scraping. He answered shortly, "Sparrowhawk they call me." The other waited a moment as if expecting some more mannerly response, and getting none, straightened up and turned a little aside. He was 2 or 3 years older than Ged, very tall, and he moved and carried himself with a stiff grace, posing, Ged thought, like a dancer. He wore a gray cloak with a hood thrown back. The first place he took Ged was the wardrobe room, where, as a student of the school, Ged might find himself another such cloak that fitted him, and any other clothing he might need. He put on the dark gray cloak he had chosen, and Jasper said, "Now you are one of us." Jasper had a way of smiling faintly as he spoke, which made Ged look for a jeer hidden in his polite words. "Do clothes make the mage?" he answered, sullen. "No," said the older boy, "though I have heard that manners make the man. Where are we?" "Where you will. I do not know the house." Jasper took him down the corridors of the great house, showing him the open courts and the roofed halls, the rooms of shelves where the books of lore and rune tomes were kept, the great hearth hall where all the school gathered on festival days, and upstairs in the towers and under the roofs, the small cells where the students and masters slept. Ged's was in the south tower, with a window looking down over the steep roofs of Thwilltown to the sea. Like the other sleeping cells, it had no furnishing but a straw-filled mattress in the corner. "We live very plain here," said Jasper, "but I expect you won't mind that." "I'm used to it." Presently, trying to show himself an equal of this polite, disdainful youth, he added, "I suppose you weren't when you first came." Jasper looked at him, and his eyes looked sad without words. "What could you possibly know about that I, son of the Lord of the Dominion of Eolg, on the Isle of Havnor, am or am not used to?" Jackson shouted, excuse me. Jackson said aloud was simply, "Come this way." A gong had been rung while they were upstairs, and they came down to eat the noon meal at the long table of the refectory, along with 100 or more boys and young men. Each waited on himself, joking with the cooks through the window hatches of the kitchen that opened into the refectory, loading his plate from great bowls of food that steamed on the sills, sitting where he pleased at the long table. "They say," Jasper told Ged, "that no matter how many sit at this table, there is always room. Certainly there was room both for many noisy groups of boys talking, eating mildly, and for older fellows, their gray, pondering faces, as if they had much to think about." Jasper took Ged to sit with a heavy-set fellow called Vetch, who said nothing much but shoveled in his food with a will. He had the accent of the East Reach, and was very dark of skin, not red-brown like Ged, and Jasper, and most folk of the archipelago, but black-brown. He was plain, and his manners were not polished. He grumbled about the dinner when he had finished it, and then turning to Ged, said, "At least it's not illusion. Like so much around here, it sticks to your ribs." Ged did not know what that meant, but he felt a certain liking for him, and was glad after the meal he stayed on with him. They went down to the town, that Ged might learn his way about it. Few and short as the streets of Twill were, they turned and twisted curiously among the high-roofed houses, and the way was easy to lose. It was a strange town, and strange also its people, fishermen and workmen and artisans like any others, but so used to the sorcery that is ever at play on the island of the wise that they seemed half sorcerers themselves. They talked, as Ged had learned, in riddles, and not showing one of them, they would blink to see a boy turn into a fish or a housefly up into the air, and knowing it for a schoolboy prank would go on cobbling shoes or cutting up mutton, unconcerned. Coming up past the back door and around through the gardens of the great house, the three boys crossed the clear running Twillburn on a wood bridge and went on northward among woods and pastures. The path climbed and wound. They passed oak groves where shadows lay thick for all the brightness of the sun. There was one grove not far away to the left that Ged could never quite see plainly. The path never reached it, though it always seemed to be about it. He could not even make out what kind of trees they were. Vetch, seeing him gazing, said softly, "This is the imminent grove. We can't come here. Yet." In the hot sunlit pastures, yellow flowers bloomed. "Sparkweed," said Jasper. "They grow where the wind dropped the ashes of burning Ilion, where Erith Akbi defended the inward isles from the Fire Lord." He blew on a withered flower head, and the seeds, shaken loose, went up on the wind like sparks of fire in the sun. The path led them up and around the base of a great green hill, round and treeless, the hill that Ged had seen from the ship as they entered the charmed waters of Roke Island. On the hillside, Jasper halted. "At home in Havnor, I have heard much about Gontish wizardry, and always in praise. Tell me, what I've wanted for a long time to see the manner of it. Here now we have a Gontishman, and we stand on the slopes of Roke Knoll, whose roots go down to the center of the earth. All spells are strong here. Play us a trick, Sparrowhawk. Show us your style." Ged, confused and taken aback, said nothing. Oh God, I just lost my... Ged, confused and taken aback, said nothing. "Later on, Jasper," Vetch said in his plain way, "let him be a while. He has neither skill nor power, or the doorkeeper wouldn't have let him in. Why shouldn't he show it now as well as later? Right, Sparrowhawk?" "I have both skill and power," Ged said. "Show me what kind of thing you're talking about." "Illusions, of course. Tricks, games of seeming, like this." Pointing his finger, Jasper spoke a few strange words, and where he pointed on the hillside among the green grasses, a little thread of water trickled and grew, and now a spring gushed out, and the water went running down the hill. Ged put his hand out in the stream, and it felt wet, drank of it, and it was cool. Yet for all that, it wouldn't quench no thirst, but being an illusion. Jasper, with another word, stopped the water, and the grasses waved dry in the sunlight. "Now you, Vetch," he said with his cool smile. Vetch scratched his head and looked glum, but he took up a bit of earth in his hand and began to sing tunelessly over it, molding it with his dark fingers and shaping it, pressing it, stroking it, and suddenly it was a small creature like a bumblebee or furry fly that flew off humming over Roke Knoll and vanished. Ged stood staring, crestfallen. What did he know but mere village witchery? Spells to call goats, cure warts, move loads, or mend pots. "I do no such tricks as these," he said. And that was enough for Vetch, who was for going on. But Jasper said, "Why don't you?" "Sorcery is not a game. We Gontish men do not play it for pleasure or praise," Ged answered haughtily. "What do you play it for?" Jasper inquired. "Money?" "No!" But he could not think of anything more to say that would hide his ignorance and save his pride. Jasper laughed, not ill-humoredly, and went on leading them on around Roquenol, and Ged followed, sullen and sore-hearted, knowing he had behaved like a fool, and blaming Jasper for it. That night, as he lay wrapped in his cloak on the mattress in his old, cold, unlit cell of stone, in the utter silence of the great house of Roque, the strangeness of the place and the thought of all the spells and sorceries that had been worked there began to come over him heavily. Darkness surrounded him. Dread filled him. He wished he were anywhere else but Roque. But Vetch came to the door, a little bluish ball of wear-light nodding over his head to light the way, and asked if he could come in and talk a while. He asked Ged about Gaunt, and then spoke fondly of his own home isles of the East Reach, telling how the smoke of village hearth fires is blown across that quiet sea at evening between the small islands with funny names, Corp, Cop, and Hope, Venway and Vemish, Ifish, Copish, and Sneg. When he sketched the shapes of those lands and the stones of the floor with his finger to show Ged how they lay, the lines he drew showed dim, as if drawn with a stick of silver for a while before they faded. Vetch had been 3 years at the school, and soon would be made sorcerer. But he thought no more performing the lesser arts of magic than a kind of birds flying. Yet he thought no more of performing the lesser arts of magic, but yet a greater unlearned skill he possessed, which was the art of kindness. That night, and always from then on, he offered and gave Ged friendship, and sure and open friendship, which Ged could not help but return. Yet Vetch was also kindly to Jasper, who had made Ged into a fool that first day on Roquenol. Ged would not forget this, nor, it seemed, would Jasper, who always spoke to him with a polite voice and mocked smile. Ged's pride would not be slighted or consented to. He swore to prove to Jasper and to all the rest of them among them whom Jasper really was. How great his power really was. Someday. For none of them, for with all their clever tricks, had saved village by wizardry. None of them had Ogion written that he would be the greatest sorcerer of all time. So, bolstering up his pride, he set up all his strong will on the works they gave him, the lessons and crafts and histories and skills taught by the Mordecai, gray-cloaked masters of Roque, who were called the Nine. Part of each day he studied with the master chanter, learning the deeds of heroes and the lays of wisdom, beginning with the oldest of all songs, the creation of Ea. Then, with a dozen other lads, he would practice with the master Winky at arts of wind and weather. Whole bright days of spring and early early summer they spent out in Roque Bay in light catboats, practicing steering by word and stilling waves and speaking to the world's wind and raising up the mage wind. They were very intricate skills, and frequently Ged's head got whacked by a swinging boom as the boat jibbed under a wind suddenly blowing backwards, or his boat and another collided, though they had the whole bay to navigate in, or all three boys in his boat went swimming unexpectedly as the boat was swamped by a huge unintended wave. There were quieter expeditions ashore other days, with the master herbal who taught them the ways and properties of things that grow, and the master hand taught sleight and jugglery in the lesser arts of changing. After all these studies, Ged was apt, and within a month was bettering lads who had been a year at Roque before him. Especially the tricks of illusion came to him so easily that it seemed he had been born knowing them and needed only to be reminded. The master hand was a gentle and light-hearted man who had endless delight in the wit and beauty of the crafts he taught. Ged soon felt no awe of him, but was asked for this spell and that spell, and always the master smiled and showed him what he wanted. But one day, having in mind to put Jasper to shame at last, Ged said to the master hand in the court of seeming, "Sir, all these charms are much the same. Knowing one, you know them all. And as soon as the wind spell weaving, or the wind, and as soon as the spell weaving ceases, the illusion vanishes. Now, if I make a pebble into a diamond," he did so with a word and the flick of a wrist, "what must I do to make that diamond remain diamond? How is the changing spell locked, and what made it lock?" The master hand looked at the jewel that glittered on Ged's palm, brought it to the prize of a dragon's, or bright as the prize of a dragon's hoard. The old master murmured one word, Tolk, and there lay the pebble. No jewel, but a rough gray bit of rock. The master took it and held it out in his own hand. This is a rock, Tolk in the true speech, he said, looking mildly up at Ged now. A bit of this rock, of which Roke Island is made, a little bit of the dry land of men which live. It is itself. It is a part of the world. But the illusion change you can make look like a diamond, or a flower, or a fly, or an eye, or a flame. The rock flickered from shape to shape as he murmured them. Gosh. Excuse me again. My eyes keep going out. The rock flickered from shape to shape as he named them and returned to rock. But that is mere seeming. Illusion fools the beholder's senses. It makes him see and hear and feel the thing that is changed. But it is not changed the thing. To learn changes to the rock into a jewel, you must change its true name. And to do that, my son, even to do so small a scrap of the world, is to change the world. It can be done. Indeed, it can be done. It is the art of the master changer. You will learn when you are ready. But you must not change one thing, one pebble, one grain of sand, until you know what good and evil will follow that act. The world is an ambulance. Inequalities. The world is in balance, in equilibrium. Excuse me. Ugh. A wizard's power of changing and of summoning can shake the balance of the world. It is dangerous, that power. It is most perilous. It must follow knowledge and serve need. To light a candle is to cast a shadow. He looked down at the pebble again. As is a good thing, though, that you too should know this, he said, speaking less gravely. If the islands of Earthsea were all made of diamonds, we'd have a hard life here. Enjoy illusions, lad, and let the rocks be rocks. He smiled, but Ged felt dissatisfied. Press a mage for his secrets, and he would always talk, like Ogion, about balance and danger in the dark. But surely a wizard, once you go talk to them, but surely a wizard who had once gone past, had gone past these childish tricks of illusions, the sorts of summoning and change, was powerful enough to do what he pleased, and balance the world as seemed best to him, and drive back darkness with his own light. In the corridor, he met Jasper, who, since Ged's accomplishments began to be praised about the school, spoke to him in a way that seemed more friendly, but was more scoffing. You look gloomy, Sparrowhawk, he said now. Did your juggling charms go wrong? Seeking, as always, to put himself on equal footing with Jasper, Ged answered the questioning, ignoring its ironic tone. I'm sick of juggling, he said, sick of these illusion tricks. If only to amuse idle lords in their castles and domains. The only true magic they've taught me yet on Roke is making wearlight and some weatherworking. The rest is mere foolery. Even foolery is dangerous, Jasper said, in the hands of a fool. At that, Ged turned as if he had been slapped and took a step towards Jasper. But the oldest boy smiled as if he had not been intending any insult, nodded his head in his stiff, graceful way, and went on. Standing there with rage in his heart, looking after Jasper, Ged swore to himself to outdo his rival, and not in some mere illusion match, but in a real test of power. He would prove himself and humiliate Jasper. He would not let the fellow stand there looking down at him, graceful, disdainful, hateful. Ged did not stop to think why Jasper might hate him. He only knew why he hated Jasper. The other apprentices had soon learned they could seldom match themselves against Ged, either in sports or in earnest. And they said of him, some in praise and some in spite, he's a wizard born. He'll never let you beat him. Jasper neither praised nor avoided him, but simply looked down at him, smiled slightly, and therefore Jasper stood alone as his rival, who must be put to shame. He did not see, or would not see, that his rivalry, which he clung to and fostered as part of his own pride, there was anything of the danger of the darkness of which the master hand had mildly warned him. When he was not moved by pure rage, he knew very well that he was yet no match for Jasper, or any of the older boys, and so he kept at his work and went on as usual. At the end of the summer, the work was slackened somewhat, so there was still more time for sport. Spellboat races down in the harbor, feats of illusion in the court of the great house. In the long evenings, a few games and wild games of hide and seek, where hider and seeker were both invisible and only voice moved laughing, calling through the trees, following and dodging the quiet, faint firelights. Then, as autumn came, they set to their tasks afresh, practicing new magic, so Ged's first months at Roke went by fast, full of passion and wonders. In winter, it was different. He was sent with 7 other boys across Roke Island to the far northernmost cape, where stands the isolate tower. There by himself lived with Master Namer, who was called by a name that had no meaning in any language. Kurim Karmarek. No farm or dwelling lay within miles of the tower. Grim it stood above the northern cliffs. Gray were the clouds over the seas of winter. Endless the lists and ranks and rounds of names that the Namer's 8 pupils must learn. Amongst them, in the tower's high room, Kurim Karmarek sat on a high seat, writing down lists of names that must be learned before the ink faded at midnight, leaving the parchment blank again. It was cold and halfway dark, and always silent there, except for the scratching of the master's pen and the sighing, maybe, of a student who must learn before midnight the name of every cape, point, bay, sound, inlet, channel, harbor, shallows, reef, and rock of the shores of Lasso, a little islet of the Pelnish Sea. If the student complained that the masters might say nothing, but lengthen the list, or he might say, he would be sea master, must know the true name of every drop of water in the sea. Ged sighed sometimes, but he did not complain. He saw that in his dusty and fathomless matter of learning the true name of every place, thing, and being. The power he wanted lay like a jewel at the bottom of a dry well. For magic consists in this, the true naming of a thing. So Kurim Karmarek had said to them once, their first night in the tower. He never repeated it, but Ged did not forget his words. May a mage of great power, he said, have many a mage of great power, he had said, spent his whole life to find out the name of one single thing lost or hidden, one single lost or hidden name. And still the lists are not finished, nor will they be till the world's end. Listen, and you will see why. In the world under the sun, and in the other world that has no sun, there is much that has nothing to do with men and men's speech, and there is power beyond our power. But magic, true magic, is worked only by those beings who speak the Hardic tongue of Earthsea, or the old speech from which it grew. That is the language dragons speak, and the language Segoi spoke, who made the islands of the world, and the language of our lays and songs, spell enchantments, and invocations. Its word lies hidden and changed among our Hardic words. We call the foam on waves Sukyin. The word is made from 2 words of the old speech, Suk, feather, and Inian, the sea. Feather of the sea is foam, but you cannot charm the foam calling it Sukyins. You must use its own true name in the old speech, which is Essa. Any witch knows a few of these words in the old speech, and a mage knows many more. But there are many more, and some have been lost over the ages, and some have been hidden, and some are known only to dragons and to the old powers of earth. But some are known to no living creature, and no man could learn them all, for there is no end to that language. Here is the reason. The sea's name is Inian, well and good. What will we call all the inmost sea has its own name also in the old speech. Since no thing can leave or have two true names, Indian can only mean all the sea except the inmost sea. And of course, it does not mean even that, for there are seas and bays and straits beyond counting that bear names of their own. So if the mage sea master were mad enough to try to lay a spell of storm or calm over all the ocean, his spell must not say only that the word Inian, but the name of every stretch and bit and part of the sea through all the archipelago and all the outer reaches and beyond to where names cease. Thus, that which gives us the power to work magic sets the limits of that power. A mage can control only what is near him, what he can name. Exactly and wholly, and this is well. If it were not so, the wickedness of the powerful or the folly of the wise would long ago have sought to change what we cannot have changed. Equilibrium would be ill-fated. The unbalanced sea would overwhelm the islands where we perilously dwell, and in the old silence all voices and all names would be lost. Ged thought long on these words, and they went deep in his understanding. Yet the majesty of the task could not make the work of that long year in the tower less hard and dry. And at the end of the year, Curum Kamarik said to him, "You have made a good beginning, but no more. Wizards speak truth, and it was still true that all the mastery of names that Ged had toiled to win that year were the mere start of what he must go on learning all his life. He was let go from the isolate tower sooner than those who had come with him, for he had learned quicker, but that was all the praise he got. He walked south across the island alone in the early winter, along townless empty roads. As night came on, it rained. He said no charm to keep the rain off. For the weather of Roke was in the hands of the master Winkey. It might be stopping. It might not be tampered with. He took shelter under the great pendic tree, and lying there wrapped in his cloak, he thought of his old master Ogion, who might still be on his autumn wanderings over the heights of Gaunt, sleeping out with leafless branches for a roof and falling rain for house walls. That made Ed smile, for he had found the thought of Ogion always a comfort to him. He fell asleep with a peaceful heart, there in the cold darkness, full of the whisper of water. At dawn, after waking, he lifted his head. The rain had ceased. He saw sheltered in the folds of his cloak, a little animal curled up asleep, which had crept there for warmth. He wondered seeing it, for it was a rare, strange beast, an otak. These creatures were found only on 4 southern islands in the archipelago: Roke, Ensmer, Pody, and Wathort. They were small, seeing creatures. They are small and sleek, with broad faces and fur dark brown or brindle, and bright, great eyes. Their teeth are cruel and their temper fierce, so they are not made pets of. They have no call or cry or any voice. Ged stroked this one, and it woke and yawned, showing a small brown tongue and white teeth, but it was not afraid. "Otak," he said, and then remembering the thousands of names of beasts he had learned in the tower, he called it by its true name in old speech. "Hoag, do you want to come with me?" The otak itself sat down on his shet and began to wash its fur. He put it upon his shoulder in the folds of his hood, and there it rode. Sometimes during the day it jumped down and darted off in the woods, but it always came back to him. Once with a wood mouse it had caught. He laughed and told it to eat the mouse, for he was fasting, this night being the festival of sun return. So he came into the wet dusk past Roke Knoll, and saw bright werelights playing in the rain over the roofs of the great house, and he entered there and was welcomed by his masters and companions in the firelit hall. It was like a homecoming to Ged, who had no home to which he could ever return. He was happy to see so many faces he knew, and happiest to see Vetch come forward to greet him with a wide smile on his dark face. He had missed his friend this year more than he knew. Vetch had been made sorcerer this fall and was apprenticed no more. But that set no barrier between them. They fell to talking at once, and it seemed to Ged that he had so that he said more to Vetch in that first hour than he had said during the whole long year at the Isolate Tower. The otak still rode upon his shoulder, nestled in the fold of his hood, as they sat at dinner at long tables set up for the festival in the hearth hall. Vetch marveled at the little creature and once put up his hand to stroke it, but the otak snipped his fingers and backed away. The little creature. Vetch marveled at the little creature and once put out his hand to stroke it, but the otak snapped his sharp teeth at him. He laughed. They say, Sparrowhawk, that a man favored by a wild beast is a man to whom the old powers of stone and spring will speak in human voice. They say Gauntish wizards often keep familiars, said Jasper, who sat on the other side of Vetch. Our Lord Nemiro has his raven, and songs say the red mage of Ark led a wild boar on a gold chain, but I have never heard of any sorcerer keeping a rat in his hood. At that they all laughed, and Ged laughed with them. It was a merry night, and he was joyful to be there in the warmth and merriment, keeping festival with his companions. But like all Jasper ever said to him, the jest set his teeth on edge. That night the Lord of O was a guest of the school himself, a sorcerer of renown. He had been a pupil of the Archmage and returned sometimes to Roke for the winter festival or the long dance in summer. With him was his lady, slender and young, bright as new copper, her black hair crowned with opals. It was seldom that any woman sat in the halls of the great house, and some of the old masters looked at her sidelong, disapproving. But the young men looked at her with all their eyes. For such a one, said Vetch to Ged, I could work fast enchantments. He sighed and laughed. She's only a woman, Ged replied. The Princess Elfarin was only a woman, said Vetch, and for her sake all of Enled was laid waste, and the hero mage of Havnor died, and the island of Solea sank beneath the sea. Old tales, said Ged, but then he too began to look at the Lady of O, wondering if indeed this was such a mortal beauty as the old tales told of. The master chanter had sung the deed of the young king, and all together had sung the winter carol. Now and then there was a little pause before all that rose from the tables. Jasper got up and went to the table nearest the hearth, where the Archmage and the guests and masters sat, and he spoke to the Lady of O. Jasper was no longer a boy, but a young man, tall and comely, with his cloak clasped at the neck with silver, for he was also been made sorcerer this year, and the silver clasp was the token of it. The lady smiled at what he said, and the opal shone in her black hair radiant. Then the masters began nodding with consent. Jasper worked an illusion charm for her. A white tree he made spring up from the stone floor. Its branches touched the highest roof beams of the hall, and on every twig of every branch a golden apple shone, each for a sun, for it was the year tree. The bird flew among the branches suddenly, all white with a tail like a fall of snow, and the golden apples dimming turned to seeds, each one a drop of crystal. These falling from the tree were like a sound of rain. All at once there came a sweet fragrance, while the trees swaying put forth leaves of rosy fire and white flowers like stars. So the illusion faded. The last 10 minutes till the illusion faded. Oh, the lady cried out with pleasure, and bent her shining head to the young sorcerer in praise of his mastery. Come with us, live with us in Otokni. Can he not come, my lord? She asked, childlike of her stern husband. But Jasper said only, When I have learned my skills worthy of my masters, here and worthy of your praise, my lady, then I will gladly come and serve you ever gladly. So he pleased all there except Ged. Ged joined his voice to the praises, but not his heart. I could have done this better, he said to himself, in bitter envy, and all the joy of the evening was darkened for him after that. Woo! Chapter 4. The Loosing of the Shadow. That spring Ged saw little of either Vetch or Jasper, for they being sorcerers studied now with the master Pattiner in the secrecy of the imminent grove, where no prentice might set foot. Ged stayed in the great house, working with the masters at all the skills practiced by sorcerers, those who work magic but carry no staff, wind bringing, weather working, finding and binding, and the arts of spellsmiths and spellwrights, tellers, chanters, heal-alls, and herbalists. At night, alone in his sleeping cell, a little ball of wear-light burning above the book in the place of lamp or candle, he studied the further runes and the runes of Ea, which are used on the great spirits and are used in great spells. All these crafts came to him easy, and it was rumored among the students that his master or that had said that the Gontish lad was the quickest student that had ever been at Roke, and tales grew up concerning the Otak, which was said to be a disguised spirit who whispered wisdom in Ged's ear, and it was even said that the Archmage's raven had hailed Ged at his arrival as Archmage to be. Whether or not they believed such stories, and whether or not they liked Ged, most of his companions admired him and were eager to follow him when the rare wild mood came over him, and he enjoyed them to lead their games in the lengthening of evenings of spring. But for the most part, he was all about work. Excuse me. But for most of the part, he was all work and pride and temper, and held himself apart. Among them all, Vetch being absent, he had no friend, and never knew he wanted one. He was 15, very young to learn any of the high arts of wizard or mage, those who carry the staff, but he was so quick to learn all the arts of illusion that the master changer, himself a young man, soon began to teach him apart from the others, and to tell him about the true spells of shaping. He explained how, if a thing is really to be changed into another thing, it must be renamed for as long as the spell lasts, and he told how this affects the names and nature of things surrounding the transformed thing. He spoke of the perils of changing, above all when the wizard transforms his own shape and thus is liable to be caught in his own spell. Little by little, drawn on by the boyish sureness of understanding, the young master began to do more than merely tell him of these mysteries. He taught him first one and then another of the great spells of change. He gave him back the book of shaping to study. This he did without knowledge of the Archmage, and unwisely, yet he meant no harm. Ged worked also with the Master Summoner now, but the Master was a stern man, aged and hardened by the deep and somber wizardry he taught. He dealt with no illusion, only true magic, the summoning of such energies as light and heat, and the force that draws the magnet, and those forces men perceive as weight, form, color, sound, real powers, drawn from the immense fathomless energies of the universe, which no man's spells or uses could exhaust or unbalance. The weather workers and seamsters calling, and sea masters calling upon wind and water were crafts already known to his pupils, but it was he who showed them why the true wizard uses such spells only at need, since to summon up such early forces is to change the earth of which they are a part. Rain on Roke may be drought in Osco, he said, and a calm in the east reach may be a storm and ruin in the west, unless you know what you are about. As for the calling of real things and living people, and the raising up of spirits of the dead, and the invocations of the unseen, those spells which are the height of the summoner's art and the mage's power, those he scarcely spoke of to them. Once or twice Ged tried to lead him to talk a little of such mysteries, but the master was silent, looking at him long and grimly, till Ged grew uneasy and said no more. Sometimes, indeed, he was uneasy working with such lesser spells as the summoner taught him. There are certain runes on certain pages of the lore book that seemed familiar to him, though he did not remember in what book he had ever seen them before. There were certain phrases that must be said in spells of summoning that he did not like to say. They made him think for an instant of shadows in a dark room, of a shut door and shadows reaching out to him from the corner by the door. Hastily he put such thoughts or memories aside and went on. These moments of fear and darkness, he said to himself, were the shadows merely of his ignorance. The more he learned, the more he would have to fear, until finally, in his full power as wizard, he needed fear nothing in the world, nothing at all. In the second month of the summer, at the school, all were gathered again at the great house to celebrate the moon's night and the long dance, which that year fell together as one festival of 2 nights, which happens but once in 52 years. All the first night, the shortest night of the full moon of the year, flutes played out in the fields, and narrow streets of Thwill were full of drums and torches, and the sound of singing went out over the moonlit waters of Roke Bay. As the sun rose next morning, the chanters of Roke began to sing the long deed of Erith Acby, which tells how the white towers of Havnor were built, and of Erith Acby's journeys from the old island Ea through all the archipelago, and of the reaches until last in the uttermost west reach, on the edge of the open sea, he met the dragon Orm, and his bones and shattered armor lie among the dragon's bones on the shore of lonely Celador. But his sword, set atop the highest tower of Havnor, still burns in the sunset above the inmost sea. When the chant was finished, the long dance began. Townsfolk and masters and students and farmers, all together, men and women, danced in the warm dust and the dust down all the roads of Roke to the sea beaches, to the beat of drums and drones of pipes and flutes. Straight out into the sea they danced. Under the moon, one night passed full, and the music was lost in the breaker's sound. As the east grew light, they came back up the beaches and the roads, the drums silent and only the flutes playing soft and shrill. So it was done on every island of the archipelago that night. One dance, one music, binding together the sea-divided lands. When the long dance was over, most people slept the day away and gathered again at evening to eat and drink. There was a group of young fellows, apprentices and sorcerers, who had brought their supper out from the refectory to hold a private feast in a courtyard of the great house. Vetch, Jasper, and Ged were there, and 6 or 7 others, and some young lads, released briefly from the isolate tower, for this festival had brought even Karam Kamarik out. They were all eating and laughing and playing such tricks out of the pure frolic as might be the marvel of a king's court. One boy had lighted the court with 100 stars of wear-light, colored like jewels, that swung in a slow netted procession between them and the real stars, and a pair of boys were playing bowls with balls of green flame and bowling pins that leaped and hopped out of the way as the ball came near. And all the while, Vetch sat cross-legged, eating roast chicken, up in mid-air. One of the younger boys tried to pull him down to earth, but Vetch merely drifted up a little higher, out of reach, and sat calmly, smiling on the air. Now and then he tossed away a chicken bone, which turned to an owl and flew hooting among the nettled starlights. Ged shot breadcrumb arrows after the owls and brought them down, and when they touched the ground, there they lay, bone and crumb, an illusion gone. Ged also tried to join Vetch up in the middle of the air, but lacking the key of the spell, he had to flap his arms to keep aloft. And they were all laughing at his flights and flaps and bumps. He kept up his foolishness for the laughter's sake, laughing with them, for after those 2 long nights of dance and moonlight and music and magery, he was in a fey and wild mood, ready for whatever might come. He came lightly down on his feet just beside Jasper at last, and Jasper, who never laughed aloud, moved away, saying, "The sparrow hawk that can't fly." "Is Jasper a precious stone?" Ged returned, grinning. "Oh, jewel among sorcerers, oh, gem of Havnor, sparkle for us." The lad that had set the lights dancing set one down to dance and glare about Jasper's head. Not quite as cool as usual, frowning, Jasper thumbed the light away and snuffed it out with one gesture. "I am sick of boys and noise and foolishness," he said. "You're getting middle-aged, lad," Vetch remarked from above. "If silence and gloom is what you want," put in one of the younger boys, "you could always try the tower." Ged said to him, "What is it you want then, Jasper?" "I want the company of my equals," said Jasper. "Come on, Vetch, leave the prentices to their toys." His voice was quiet, but all the other boys suddenly fell still, for in his tone, as in Jasper's, the spite between them now sounded plain and clear, as steel coming out of its sheath. "Power," Jasper said. "I'll match you, power, for act. You challenge me? I challenge you." Vetch had dropped to the ground and now came between them, grim of face. Duels and sorcery are forbidden to us, and well you know it. Let this cease. Both Ged and Jasper stood silent, for it was true they knew the law of Roke, and they also knew that Vetch was moved by love, and themselves by hate. Yet their anger was balked, not cooled. Presently moving a little side, as if to be heard by Vetch alone, Jasper spoke, with his cool smile. I think you'd better remind your goatherd friend again of the law that protects him. He looks sulky. I wonder, did he really think I'd accept a challenge from him? A fellow who smells of goats, apprentices, who doesn't know the first change? Jasper, said Ged. What do you know of what I know? For an instant, with no word spoken that any heard, Ged vanished from their sight, and where he had stood a great falcon hovered, opening its hooked beak to scream. For one instant, and then Ged stood again in the flickering torchlight, his dark gaze on Jasper. Jasper had taken a step backward in astonishment. Now he shrugged and said one word, illusion. The others muttered. Vetch said, that was no illusion. It was true change. And enough, Jasper. Listen. Enough to prove that he sneaked a look in the book of Chaping behind the master's back. What then? Go on, goatherd. I like this trap you're building for yourself. The more you try to prove yourself my equal, the more you show yourself for what you are. At that, Vetch turned from Jasper and said very softly to Ged, Sparrowhawk, will you be a man and drop this now? Come with me. Ged looked at his friend and smiled, but all he said was, keep Hogue for me a little while, will you? He put into Vetch's hand the little otak, which, as usual, had been riding on his shoulder. It had never let anyone but Ged touch it, but it came to Vetch now, and climbing up on his arm, cowered on his shoulder, its bright eyes always on its master. Now, Ged said to Jasper, quietly as before, what are you going to do to prove yourself my superior, Jasper? I don't have to do anything, goatherd, yet I will. I will give you a chance, an opportunity. Envy eats you like a worm in an apple. Let's let out the worm. Once by Roke Knoll, you boasted that Gontish wizards don't play games. Come to Roke Knoll now and show us what it is they do instead. And afterward, maybe I will show you a little sorcery. Yes, I should like to see that, Ged answered. The younger boys, used to seeing his black temper break out at the least hint of a slight or insult, watched him in wonder at his coolness now. Vetch watched him not in wonder, but with growing fear. He tried to intervene again, but Jasper said, come, keep out of this, Vetch. What will you do with the chance I give you, goatherd? Will you show us an illusion, a fireball, a charm to cure goats that will merge? Or a charm to cure goats with mange? What would you like me to do, Jasper? The older lad shrugged. Summon up a spirit from the dead for all I care. I will. You will not. Jasper looked straight at him, rage suddenly flaming out over his disdain. You will not, you cannot, you brag and brag. By my name, I will do it. They all stood utterly motionless for a moment, breaking away from Vetch, who would have held him back by main force. Ged strode out of the courtyard, not looking back. The dancing wear-lights overhead died out, sinking down. Jasper hesitated a second, then followed after Ged, and the rest came straggling behind, in silence, curious and afraid. And I think, because my voice is starting to run out and I am getting dead tired, we will end this stream right here. So thank you one and all who hung in there with me as I garbled my words and struggled to read. Usually I'm much better at this, but I'm running right now on around 3 hours of sleep and my eyes are starting to fade a little bit. So before my next game, which is at midnight tonight, I'm going to get some sleep in. And I please urge you, if you enjoyed this, to send in some donations to the Known World United donation page. We've got a lot of more games going on the rest of the weekend, tonight and tomorrow morning into the early afternoon. So yeah, once again, thank you so much. I've been Colin, your reader for these last 2 hours, and I thank you so much for spending time with me. Once again, I was reading A Wizard of Earthsea, written by Ursula K. Le Guin, out of this fine collection, The Books of Earthsea. I highly recommend it. It's really wonderful. Um, and with that, I bid everyone a really pleasant evening and a wonderful night. And I will say a goodbye. Mwah.